Hello and welcome back to the Long Live Rock and Roll podcast. As Britpop began to wane, certain British bands started to abandon the emphatic, polished sound that we were used to from Blur and Oasis in favour of a more gritty, energetic rock style. Word Gets Around by Stereophonics is a very easy to listen to album that transcends both rock and pop individually and was one of those transitional albums that kept the ideals and attitude of the 90s but added a raw and melodic personality that became synonymous with early 2000s British rock. Joining me to discuss this album is my co-host, Mr. Felipe Amarin. How you doing, bro?
Doing great, man. And you?
Good. Yeah, very well, thank you. We're currently basking in sweltering English heat, aren't we?
Yeah, exactly.
We were just discussing that we, myself and Felipe, we've been and we've toured around the world, and we've been to Brazil, and it was 40 degrees every day, wasn't it?
Yeah,
and we were just saying,
40,
25 degrees in England, it feels worse than 40 degrees in Brazil, doesn't it?
I think you just get used to the cold, isn't it? And then when it goes, anything above 20 is too much for me in the UK, not elsewhere in the world.
It's a massive culture shock, isn't it? It's like, what's going on? The sun for 5 days straight? What are you talking
Time to
about?
stop complaining about the cold and start complaining about the heat.
There you go. It's one or the other, isn't it? Never both. But anyway, talking about Britain and British bands, as I mentioned, we are doing Word Gets Around by Stereophonics today. So I'll give you some quick fire facts before asking Felipe a question. So the album was released on the 25th of August 1997, recorded between October 1992 and February 1997, but I assume that's probably they had some songs from a few years ago that they sort of reworked. The genre, now this is the interesting part, we've got rock, indie rock and Britpop. More on that later. The length of the album is just over 42 minutes, released on the label V2 and was produced by Bird and Bush. So the first question I want to ask you, Felipe, is every week we seem to do these albums that have massive meaning behind them. We do the Beatles, we do Van Halen, we do Led Zeppelin, we do Fleetwood Mac. This initially feels like a big step down from those classic albums. So can I ask you what made you choose an album that is way more normal than epic?
Well, that's the thing. This album was recommended to me by Phil, a good friend of mine, who is Welsh.
Okay, that explains something.
That explains a lot. So because we were talking about the Stereophonics, and he said, "Man, you got to do the first album." And I said, "Why the first album, right? Because they have some iconic, like, best-selling albums, right? They've been on top of the charts like so many times. The Stereophonics had 5 consecutive #1 albums in the UK. This is like,
it's a big deal.
It's quite a record, isn't it? And this is one of the 3 albums out of the, I think, 11 album discography that didn't make it to the top of the charts. And that's why I wondered, why is this a good album to listen to? So I started listening to it, and I think we very often talk about the albums that changed the direction of a band and made them a mainstream band. And I think with this Stereophonics, is right from the beginning, they had the key elements that made them a phenomenal band, a band that
the
deserves,
pieces already, didn't they?
All the seeds are there. The thing is, this album particularly didn't go that well compared to what came after, to everything that came after the album. But I think if you want to know who the Stereophonics actually are, you got to listen to this album. That's why. And everyone knows them. Like in the UK, they're huge. And I think a lot of people in America and South America know them as well. But if you want to know how everything started out, this album is just like really good to listen to. I highly recommend.
It's a good point, and I think it's one of those albums where, as you said, the band kind of, they got it, that they started and they didn't stop. It's not like, as you said, they do a few albums and then they found their sound. They hit the ground running with this, and even reading what fans think of this album, many songs from here are still fan favorites, and Stereophonics still play live. I don't know if they're still touring, but like even years and years later, they're still playing songs from this album, which is a massive testament to how good the album is and how much the fans love it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they are one of the most iconic British bands from the 90s, but sometimes people forget where everything started from, because everyone knows Dakota, everyone knows Maybe Tomorrow and all the other hits they had that came a bit later in their career. But this album, as an album, more than individual songs, as an album, I think it's got everything that define the sound of the Stereophonics.
Yeah. So you mentioned your Welsh friend. Do you want to expand on why Welsh people like this band,
I
and
think
then in
that
particular
probably,
this album?
yeah, yeah. Well, I think he's not from the valleys like the Stereophonics, but I think the whole idea that the songs are about life in Wales, right? It's not about. It's very specific about like small town lifestyle,
Yeah, it's a
and
little village
yeah,
called. I mean, I'm not even going to try Welsh, but it's okay. Like Cumaman.
right. See,
There you go.
I wouldn't dare to try to pronounce any any Welsh words. People kill me for
I'm
that.
allowed to get
So it's
away
just
with it because I'm British.
yeah, exactly. I don't try. It just sounds awful when I try. Yeah,
But yeah, as
but
you said, this is an album full of songs detailing
yeah,
and storytelling about life, the normal working class life, and the working class struggles of a man or a family or a person in this little Welsh village.
yeah, exactly. And you see a lot of personal struggles and problems that also actually also happen in big cities and everywhere in the world. But it's really interesting to see under the perspective of just a local guy who's reading the news, or it's really cool because it talks about reading the news and the lyrics, but the idea of word gets around is like in a small town, you hear it from people first
It's a
before
lovely
it makes
title,
it.
isn't it?
Yeah,
When you know
before
what
it
the
makes
album's about, the title makes sense.
the whole album has a certain connection. It's not a concept album, but the whole album has some sort of reference to the idea of word gets around, with the idea of like local people talking about local issues, talking about tragic deaths, and it's interesting. The other thing that really fascinates me about the album is how sad it can be at some points, and how light-hearted it can be at other points. So
Yeah.
so you got songs about just drinking and having fun, and you've got songs about people who died tragically, and the way they balance it out is really cool, because I think it kind of shows you life has got a little bit of everything.
I feel like it's almost a quintessential British album. And you know that is such a big statement to say when you've got bands like Led Zeppelin, the Beatles, and the Who doing their thing. But just in terms of a down to earth album, that and when I'm saying this, I'm generalising a lot, but I think a lot of British people like music like this. I think Zeppelin and the Who might be a bit too heavy for some people, a bit too old for other people. The Beatles probably definitely too old for some people. But do you understand what I'm saying? This album just feels like, as well as the storytelling of the British, it's from British people. As I mentioned, the British ethics and values and
Yeah,
morals and storytelling that's in it. It just
yeah.
feels so quintessentially British to me.
It does. It does. I think I might have been here long enough to identify those things and see. Oh, I understand why people. I understand why the Stereophonics are bigger in the UK than anywhere else, because it really speaks to the people of Wales and the rest of the UK.
Yeah.
And I think I mean, the storytelling is really interesting that you mentioned storytelling as a strong point, and I think that's Kelly Jones's like biggest skill. I would say his main skill is to be capable of telling stories in a way that you want to listen to the story all the way to the end, and you can picture a scene in your mind. You can see the story. I think every song in
Mm.
this album is like an episode of a series that I want to watch and get and get to the end of it. And there's not a single song in the album that doesn't make me think of the scene, like, because it describes things so well and there's so much
Yeah.
detail, and it makes you think of the local boy in the photograph, makes you think of the newspaper with that boy's picture. It makes you think about everyone getting really upset with the football coach, which is mentioned in the first song. You can see people talking, you can see the things happening, and I think I think that's the main point, the
Yeah.
main reason for me to like an album like this.
Well, as we mentioned, it is their debut album, and I think that's the point that we should sort of talk about for a bit, because to come in with such personality and such vigor and such a concise sound, I think is really admirable. I mean, culturally, capturing the British life in the late 90s, as we've just said. It does this perfectly. And Kelly Jones, as you said, you know, his writing in this is fantastic. Just, you know, getting across the values of a small Welsh town and everything you mentioned. For a debut album, I think it's really great, isn't it?
It is really good. And I think, as I said, some of the topics and some of the concepts can be deep in a certain way, but they approach in a laid back, non-pretentious way. And I think that's probably what you're describing when you say it's very British. It's almost like, yeah, you know, not too bad kind of thing.
It kind of, one of the songs, which one is it? Last of the Big Time Drinkers. It's got that drum beat that's like, you know, Chelsea Dagger by the
it's a shuffle groove like that one. Yeah.
Whenever I think you and me, we know that whenever we hear that, it's like British wedding.
Yeah.
Midnight, you're playing the final two songs before the bride and groom go off and the wedding ends. It's
the only song in the album with a piano solo, you know, which is like,
there you go. Yeah. Just sorry for listeners and viewers, just quickly, as I always say, at the bottom of the show notes, there will be a link to the episode playlist, and the episode playlist will take you to Spotify, where I've made a playlist that has all the songs on the album and any other songs we mention. So I'm going to put Chelsea Dagger in there right now. I'm sure everyone knows it, but if you don't, check it out. But yeah,
at least everyone in the UK knows that.
Yeah, it's law. It's like Mr. Brightside as well. Right. Anything specific you want to talk about?
Well, I do want to talk about a couple of songs and lyrics. Just mention the idea of storytelling that we're talking about. The third song in the album is probably my favorite in terms of lyrics. More Life in a Trump's Vest, which is this, you know, backpacker in a street market, like just describing the end of his shift when someone is like, you know, it's cheaper down the road. He's like, go and buy from them. So like he's like getting pissed off at the customers at the end of his shift, and he's really annoyed that nothing happens in his life. And it's such, you just get involved with this story and think like, yeah, I feel you, brother. Like this is painful. Everyone had those jobs or is still in one of those jobs. You know, it just describes feelings that I think every person can relate to. I love that. I think, and it's just good fun, really.
I think lyrically, one of the funniest ones I thought is that I'm listening to this album and I'm like, yeah, this is really easy to listen to. It's really lovely. It's nice to just put on. You know, I wouldn't sit there and analyze it for chord progressions. It all seems very simple in that sense. Yeah. But in terms of, you know, just nice to put on in the background, I get to song number 7, Check My Eyelids for Holes, and I'm thinking, hold on, pause a second.
That's you didn't know the expression. I didn't know that.
Lyrics I would expect to hear in a Slayer song, like Check My Eyelids for Holes. I'm like, what? Hold on, what are we doing here? But yeah, this is quite.
But you know what that means, right?
What? No, I don't actually.
No, it's when you fall asleep. So someone says, "Were you sleeping?" No, just checking my eyelids for holes.
British and never heard of that. So
I never heard of that. I had to research that. So basically, Stuart Cable, the drummer, he fell asleep in a pub after drinking too much, and then and the landlord was like, "Guys, you got to leave. You've drunk too much." And apparently, Kelly Johnson, no, he's not asleep. He's just checking his eyelids for holes.
I'm going to use that now. That is just brilliant. But yeah, a few other songs you said you wanted to talk about.
Well, yeah. So we're talking about the light-hearted side of the album and those songs that make you just laugh. But there's there's another one who's not, which kind of stands in between the saddest ones and the happiest ones, which is the song "Traffic." Fifth. Track
I love that one. I really enjoyed that.
So basically, the band was stuck in traffic, right? And they were just watching the other cars also stuck in traffic. And they started to make up stories about who is that person, what they're doing, where they're going. So the song is about one particular woman, and he starts describing like what she's going to do after that. And he comes up with a million different scenarios, from she's a nurse without a job, or she's got a body in the boot. So like there's all sorts of stories that can't possibly be real, or maybe they can, or whatever. So it's just like, I think that's the skill of a really good songwriter. You see something that you don't even know what it is, and you can still write about it. So he's writing this story about this woman stuck in traffic. There's literally nothing happening, and he makes something happen in the lyrics. It's really beautiful. About the most tragic ones, you get, obviously everyone talks about Local Boy in the Photograph, which was a boy that Kelly Jones knew from school or from playing football or something like that. and sometimes the topic we don't want to talk much about is kind of really depressing, isn't it? But he said that the song was intended to be more about his life than his death, and I find this really beautiful. On the same topic of death, Billy Davis' Daughter, which is the last song of the album, I think is
She died.
like, yeah, and yeah, exactly. Apparently jumping from a bridge or something, and it's one of those things that again it relates of the phrase word gets around is in the song at the end. It's the last line of the album, and he's basically saying, I didn't even know her name, but you heard the story, you know. So you know, Billy Davis got a daughter, you know, young daughter. It's just, you know, and now he's left with just a dream. So it's really cool, really sad, but like the way is really cool. The way he touches a sad subject and make it poetic. So it's not, but it is sad. But listen, we made music out of it, and we kind of celebrating those people's lives rather than their deaths. And I think it's a difficult way of approaching these subjects, but I think he did it really, really well.
I think if you do an album that's over that has a central theme, and then you veer off the theme to do a song about someone who you know who died, it can stand out quite a bit. And as you say, it might not necessarily have a good place in the album. But going through each of these songs and seeing a different aspect of what he's talking about in this Welsh town, this is really weird. I've got goosebumps talking about it because I just feel like this is an amazing album for storytelling, because we're just getting every song. There could be something that happens on a different day. Monday, 1,000 trees. Tuesday, the local boy. The Thursday, the traffic. Then on Sunday, Billy Davies' Daughter. You know, and just having these experiences and almost experiencing them as Kelly Jones experienced it. It's just like, I want to say a day in the life, but because it's 12 songs, I'm going to say 2 weeks in the life of Kelly Jones and Stereophonics.
It could have been two weeks, could have been 10 years, because as a matter of fact, we tend to believe that nothing happens in a small town, but everything happens in a small town. You know, but sometimes you don't hear about it. Yeah.
But I was going to say, for us Brits, you know that if you watch Coronation Street, EastEnders, or Emmerdale, because it's always...
You know, I never watched that.
No, man, they're absolutely shit. But yeah, they're British. They're British. So what do you call them? They're British soap operas, and the idea is that they're filled with drama. Every day, someone is angry at someone else. I'm thinking, do these people not just have one day off? Like, you know. Yeah. But as you said, it could be 2 weeks, it could be 10 years. But we've got a real insight into the lives of the people of this town and what they experience. I think it's lovely.
Yeah, it's great.
I want to talk about Britpop.
Yes,
which is really interesting, because as we saw at the top, as I said at the top, the genres associated with this album: rock, indie rock, and Britpop. And I think one of them's correct. I think indie rock is correct. But I want to just give a little brief history about indie rock, because I learned this yesterday and today. This is all new to me, and it's new to me because of this. I'll tell you how I got through it. So I was looking at the accolades and the critical praise for this album, and it reached number 6 in the UK charts and number 8 in the New Zealand charts, and everywhere else it was like 30, 40, 70. And I thought, that's really weird. Like, why UK and New Zealand? And then I found out that the UK and New Zealand were essentially the first nations to have this indie rock uprise, if you like, that came out of their cultures. In New Zealand, I think they call it Dunedin rock, which is a specific kind of subgenre. But anyway, you can look into that. It's really interesting. But then I just started down the rabbit hole of indie rock, and what is this? And this is why I felt this album is so important. So here we go. In the 1980s, you've got bands like the Smiths, REM, Sonic Youth, just sort of really the fallout of punk, the rock sound, the do-it-yourself ethos that these bands were portraying. Independent labels like Rough Trade, Creation Records, and Factory Records, all now starting to sort of, as I said, independently do and release their own music. Then you got the 90s, where grunge paved the way for alternative music and not so poppy music. And what that did is it said to everyone, actually, we don't need love songs to be popular, as Nirvana showed. You just need a song about, get a real gritty song and then the audience will love it. Grunge opened that avenue up to the world, saying we don't need just simple, sing-along choruses. And Britpop blended the DIY ethos of those 80s bands with the pop characteristics. So there you've got the like of Oasis, Blur, Radiohead, Pulp, The Verve, who took this do-it-yourself approach, maybe with some independent labels, the fallout of punk, and established it into this kind of rock, but with a poppier sound, as the saying goes, Britpop. Then in 1997, the fateful year that album was released was also the year that Britpop supposedly started to decline. Blur shifted their sound. They changed it around a bit from what the audience loved. Oasis's album that was released in 97 wasn't well received and it wasn't as successful as the other ones. Radiohead with OK Computer went way more electronic and ambient than poppy. So Britpop started to go down, and because all these other bands, Oasis and Blur, started doing different things. And then Word Gets Around releases. And I'm not saying this is the only album that made that transition. There's probably a few. But Word Gets Around comes out, and I think you hear the best parts of Britpop stripped down, less production, less polished, no orchestras, no big sounds, just a rock band doing the Britpop attitude. And then couple that with the fact that we've now entering the 2000s, where the internet allows independent bands to reach so many more audiences. We had this rise of what we now call indie rock. Stereophonics, Keane, Kaiser Chiefs, Kasabian, Coldplay. These bands were considered post-Britpop. But looking back on it now, we can kind of say, actually, you know, technically they were post-Britpop, but let's call them the beginning of indie rock. As that started to develop, you get the sort of the stable indie rock, Franz Ferdinand, Arctic Monkeys, Block Party, those kind of bands. And then, you know, the indie that we think of more today is like indie, folky. And then you had that branch of folk music come off with bands like Foals, Kooks, Mumford & Sons. So that's just a quick little history into indie rock, which I learned today, which I'm fascinated. You know, I love the evolution of music and the genealogy and what branches out where. And I thought that was really cool, just seeing that actually Stereophonics with this album were in that transitional stage from Britpop declining to indie rock rising up.
It's not an easy place to be when everyone is getting kind of, especially when the media is getting like tired of a certain style, when they have used that style for long enough and they say, you know what, let's just like leave Britpop alone. Let's not talk about this anymore. And they that's the thing. Stereophonics would never be happy to be called a Britpop band.
No, they weren't.
They have their own sound. They came out of something with something new. So everyone was kind of sick of the same formula. It always happens with every style, isn't it? Someone does something new, everyone copies them, and then you gotta have a band or two or three that come at the end of that of the period of when one genre dominated the scene. Someone has to come and say, look, we're doing something new. Don't call us the same name you call those guys, because we're doing something that is unique and we don't want to be compared to anyone else. And I think they were good enough to have the attitude. There's a lot of
album certainly was.
Yeah, this album is, and they recorded as a power trio. So they've been touring with two guitars for quite a while, I guess. But they recorded this as a trio, and it's super cool to have like guitar, bass, drums, and that's it.
That's true, yeah. So you've got Kelly Jones on vocals and guitars, Richard Jones on bass. I'm assuming maybe they're brothers.
They're not related. No, they're not.
No, that's silly me for assuming. And Stuart Cable on drums. But you're right, man. When you've got bands like Oasis, who are listen, their 1997 album. I don't know Oasis very well, so don't shoot me for not knowing it. Their 1997 album apparently was still very good. But it just didn't reach the heights of Definitely Maybe and What's the Story, Morning Glory. And when you've got bands like Oasis being compared to the Beatles, like the best pop band since the Beatles, and you've had a few decades in between the Beatles and Oasis, so it's not like they said, oh, they're the Beatles of the 60s, they're the Beatles of the 70s, they're the Oasis got a big, you know, there was a lot of pressure put on them for that. And then, as you said, as the genre starts to decline, if you're the band picking up the pieces saying, well, where do we go from here? I just think it's really interesting that when you think of Oasis and Blur, the height of their music, their second, third albums, you're hearing big orchestrations. I think of that Blur song, is it the Universal? It really, really could happen. Just big orchestras, an emphatic sound, really polished production. And then for Stereophonics to go, actually, do you know what? I don't think this is working. Let's pull everything back. Just a power trio as you
They
said,
were
rock
a band.
instrumentation.
They were a band that played for years in small venues, pubs, and workmen's clubs. That kind of stuff. So
Yeah,
they lived the reality of a rock band, building their way up to the top. So
yeah,
and
that's
the
really
album
cool.
reflects that really well, I guess.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. But so all of those bands I just mentioned, I've put a song from each of those bands in the playlist. It's not like chronological. I mean, it's mainly I've got the 80s ones, the 90s ones, the 2000s. Each song isn't chronological, but just listen through it. If you're checking out the playlist, go from the Smiths and go all the way to Mumford and Sons and just hear how you got those 80s bands that's a bit punky, 90s bands where it's Britpop, a bit more poppy, then the early 2000s where it's a bit more stripped back, and then later 2000s where it becomes a bit more folky. So check that out in the playlist below. Anything you want to speak about?
I just want to ask you, what's your favorite song or any song that surprised you in the album?
Do you know what? I've got a top three, and I can't put them in order. I loved A Thousand Trees,
Great.
Not Up to You, and Traffic.
Great.
I just hear it in A Thousand Trees. I just hear someone wanting to give me a message. And even if I didn't read into the Welsh heritage, if all I came away from that song was being told that actually, one tree can make 1,000 matches and one match can burn 1,000 trees, then that's fine. I think that's a metaphor. It is, yeah. But even if there's meaning behind that sentence, even if that's all I took is that okay, you can make a match out of a tree, the delivery and the performance from Kelly Jones really makes you just it hits home.
It does. It does. Every single time. His vocals are like emotional and passionate all the time. I'd like to mention the song "Looks Like Chaplin," which is the second one. I think was the second single.
Yeah, it's quite heavy, that one. I like it.
It's heavy. I just want to say this. Didn't that one remind you of grunge? There's a little bit of Alice in Chains and Stone Temple Pilots on that one, which quite surprised me because I know I obviously knew all Stereophonics hits, but this one is not like it wasn't a well-known song to me, at least. And you have like the falsetto and the high-pitched notes that he normally doesn't use, not that often. Is aggressive at some points, more melodic at other points. I think in terms of vocal performance, this song is beautiful and it's kind of heavy, and it does remind me of the American music in the 90s. It does remind of the Seattle scene.
So as you said, the grunge, that's a great point. I also liked Bill Davies' Daughter, really reminded me of Wild Horses by the Stones.
Yeah,
and his vocal tone.
Yeah.
And a cello,
Yeah. Again, that's the other song. Those two songs are the ones that he uses a kind of a different vocal style. Really cool, really surprised me in a good way.
But it's a great album with plenty of songs. It's not all full energy. I haven't made lots of notes on the songs because they do have a cohesive sound. It's not like one song's that different to the others. But one interesting point is Not Up to You. They used programmed drums at the start, which I just thought was kind of odd.
The only one in the album, I guess. And halfway through the song, there's real drums. Yeah, really cool. But it was already a thing in the 90s. But for a three-piece kind of garage rock band to do that, it wouldn't be a cool thing, but they did it so well. And when the real drums come in, the song becomes something completely different. So,
excellent. Well, I'll finish off then with how this album was praised, basically, and what it meant. So, got a lot of critical praise and success for the lyrical depth, which we've touched on, and just the raw energy of the album, just nice and simple. Several hit singles received a lot of radio play and became sort of staples in the band's live sets. As I already mentioned, number 6 in the UK, number 8 in New Zealand. It went platinum 3 times. Which is a big deal, and the longevity of the album, I think, is something we also got to celebrate. It still remains a classic of the band. There's a lot of bands who you might think, do you know what, their first album, skip the first one, go to the second and third one, but this one is one that the Stereophonics fans will tell you, keep going. But it's an important album as well, just a few little, and when I say innovations, I'm not saying Stereophonics or anything like the Beatles or like Metallica. It's not like they changed music drastically, but little things they did amongst other bands in the late 90s that moved us away from Britpop into a bit more of a raw sound. As I just said, gritty raw sound that presented a new edge to the music that contrasted the polished Britpop that we were used to from the mid-90s. It just showed that as Britpop was waning, there was still a massive appetite for British rock. that was away from the Britpop, that didn't really sort of fall into that category. And because of this, because of this debut album and their subsequent works, they became one of the leading bands of the indie British scene of the late 90s and early 2000s. Like Travis, Coldplay, really made a mark on the world.
Yeah, they have a well-deserved place in rock history.
I agree. Yeah, excellent. Any final points?
No, I think that's all from me. Yeah.
Should I do my monologue then?
Yes, please.
Excellent. Okay.
I couldn't sleep this week. Oh my God! What is Lance going to say in his
I've been waiting for this episode for a while. We had last week off because I was a bit ill. So we've been waiting for this for 2 weeks now, and I'm really excited because my first thought, as I said at the start of the show, was, what do you, like with Zeppelin, Fleetwood Mac, Deep Purple, Stereophonics? What do you mean? So that was really, and I'm sort of jokingly having a go at it, but it was really nice. But anyway, here's the monologue. It seems to me that Word Gets Around came about not only at the perfect time for Stereophonics, but the perfect time for British rock music. As Britpop was waning and beginning to decline, Stereophonics came out with a raw, energetic answer to Britpop's polished and established sound, and, with a host of other bands, swung British pop and rock music to another avenue, very similar and not that far from what came before, but definitely a fresher sound for British rock music. As for the band themselves, the album has stood the test of time with the fans and delivers a very personable, relatable performance from Kelly Jones with his lyrics and songwriting. The album has a beautiful blend of rock characteristics merged with pop sensibilities, and I think this is why it works. You allow younger audiences to rock out and let their hair down whilst also being able to sing anthemic choruses and singable melodies. I was jokingly dismissive of this album, but listening to it, it's a pleasure to listen to and might be the definition of easy listening for me. As I said above, rock instrumentation with easy melodies means I can put this album on for myself and others, but still get a little kick out of it. It sits perfectly between the likes of Oasis, Radiohead and Blur, and Keane, Kaiser Chiefs and Coldplay, playing a crucial role in the development and manifestation of Britpop and the rise and pioneering of British indie rock.
Yeah, well said, as usual.
I'm sure there's a bunch of other albums that came out in the late 90s that did the same job, but this is the first one I've heard where it's clicked for me. This is the gap between Britpop and indie rock. This is how we got here. And I'm really impressed. So thank you very much for choosing.
Thanks to Phil for recommending.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Wait, Phil means Felipe. Are you a double agent?
He's part of the Felipe's club.
Excellent. I'm going to finish off by asking you, what makes this album rock and roll?
Wow. 3 young men with their guitars and drums talking about their personal lives and lives of their neighbors in the UK in the late 90s. I mean, they're not trying to be anything else but themselves.
And that's rock and roll.
And they are loud and roll. So that's rock and roll.
Yes, and that's rock and roll. Excellent, guys. Well, thank you for joining us for another episode of the Long Live Rock and Roll podcast. You know the terms and conditions by now, but if you're new here, please give us a like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, or if you're listening on Apple, Amazon, or Spotify, please just scroll down and give us a review. It takes 20 to 30 seconds of your time, but means the world to us because it shoots us up the charts. The algorithms get played with and we get seen by more people. So it means the world to us if you could just either like and subscribe on YouTube or give us a review on the podcast platform you're listening to. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks for being with us again. Well, thanks for everyone who's been with us for the first time. Yeah, keep on rocking, everyone, and don't do anything I wouldn't do.
As usual, guys, take care and long live rock and roll.